Welcome viewers to 27th episode of BeyondPhrenology. We are extremely delighted to have with us Professor David Rosenbaum from University of California, Riverside. Uh, this podcast will be a little unique in the sense that we have had people talking about motor control a lot of times. Professor Rosenbaum is a little different person in motor control community, that he's also interested in the psychology behind it, the decision-making processes behind it, and all the cognitive aspects of motor control, especially when we are talking about movements of the upper hand. Professor Rosenbaum is extremely accomplished. I remember reading about his work when I started my first project on monkeys in about, I think it was 2012. And his idea of end state comfort was fundamental in how we design experiment. We informed research on laterality using Professor Rosenbaum's insights, which had not been done before. And since then, he had an impression. I never had a chance to interact with him. I switched fields several times. However, when I'm back doing neuroscience and motor control research, Professor Rosenbaum still plays a very foundational person in who have influenced me, and I'm very fortunate to have him accepted this invite and he'll be here with us. So, Professor Rosenbaum, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much.
So I know this no amount of introduction would give justice to your extremely long career. I think you have spent more time doing research, probably 15 years more than my age, just just doing work on human motor control. And you have been very productive with multiple books, hundreds of articles, and providing some really fundamental, I would say, not so popular, not so intuitive ideas, about motor control at different points in time.
Well, let me first of all thank you so very, very much for this kind introduction. And as I said to you when we started writing, I would refuse to let this podcast immediately go down the rabbit hole of who this particular person is, and their story and their research and all that. I said to you, I wrote to you an email, I will refuse to do that because I want to know about you. And I would wager that many people who watch or listen to this podcast would like to know something about you. Let me introduce you. Ironically, I am, by the way, very dedicated to teaching, to mentoring, and to being one of scores of faculty who want to put younger, more junior investigators up front. And so my understanding of your background, Dr. Do you pronounce it Mangalam?
Yes.
Madhur.
That's accurate.
Is that you're from India?
Yeah.
And you have worked in Athens, Georgia?
Yeah, I did my PhD there with Professor Dori Fagesi. Yeah.
Yes. And postdoc at Northeastern University? Yes. But not with Dagmar Sterna. You must have interacted.
No, I worked with Gene Tunick in a, it was a department, across the road. But yeah, I know her.
Of course. And you're now at the University of Nebraska at Omaha.
Yeah.
Which is a wonderful city. And your background officially is biomechanics, but you have a strong interest and strong background in psychology, and including cognition, which is my area of interest. You have, pardon me, you've published at such an incredibly high rate and in very fine journals, and on a broad range of topics, ranging from behavioral science to very advanced mathematical modeling of dynamical systems and the like. And you've also engaged, as far as I can tell, in some philosophizing
Yes.
about issues in epistemology. And on top of your enormous scholarly productivity, you are engaged in this wonderful public-facing work of running this podcast series, which is a very extraordinary thing for an academic to do. And I think you're doing a great service. And I'm on the University Tenure and Promotion Committee at the University of California, Riverside, and I would be very happy if, pardon me, if you were to include a link to this particular podcast and direct attention to deans or whomever to this early part where somebody, without getting paid, by the way, is expressing his tremendous admiration for all that you've done. So I really want to thank you. May I just ask you one or two, how did you, well, a question, a couple of questions about your research, if I may. So what do you see as your kind of most important, most noteworthy research accomplishment or line thus far in your very early career? Would you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So first of all, Professor Rosenbaum, that was very kind of you to introduce, and it really means, some words like that from a person of your stature. Second,
I'm sitting. My stature is just sitting.
still.
I'm just sitting. Please.
I mean, I think the most important contribution is that we are moving away from. I mean, it's a common knowledge, but my work as a compendium provides a very strong base for moving away from linear thinking about the body and physiology, and kind of convinces that we need a very nonlinear, a circular framework to understand physiology rather than finding a cause at a very localized place. So most of my work involves multi-scale modeling, where we look at phenomena acting at different time scales with the idea that you have multiple processes, short-scale processes, long-scale processes, which interact together in different fashions to produce adaptive behavior. And the health and disease should be monitored based on that, and rehabilitation should be focused on playing around with those different processes instead of finding a cause at a certain place, whether it's somewhere in the brain or somewhere in the body, and trying to figure out where, localize that cause and change that cause, given that the whole physiology is very much interactive in nature. So it has several challenges. One of this as epistemic challenge, it's a new kind of knowledge. Then second is about, how you design experiments. It kind of percolates at every levels of how we do science. It percolates to how we analyze, given that traditional analysis has been very limited in terms of identifying these kind of interactions, and how we interpret those interactions. So it includes work starting from simulations, where we know the ground truth of what statistics we use, we establish those. Moving to designing experiments which do not have that localization as an end goal, to analysis and interpretation, with the idea that if we can have if we can convince and make a case from all four sides, from all four of these perspectives, we can change or we can study human physiology in a distinct way. But the main question which motivates me is, the age-old, and you have talked about it a lot, is the Bernstein's degrees of freedom perspective. That how is a system which has so much redundance or different degrees of freedom is able to achieve a goal at a particular scale, and how we can move skillfully. We can repeat movements without actually repeating them.
So you've spoken about your approach.
Yeah.
And is there a particular finding from the experiments or from your analyses that may have been unexpected before you came along?
Yeah. So for instance, one of the studies where we looked at dynamic touch. So Professor Michael Turvey and colleagues, and you have worked with several of those, at UConn, have this dynamic touch framework where the idea is that how do we sense how long an object is while closing our eyes. So for instance, I can wield this pen in my hand and it might be a new pen and I can still touch my nose without knowing where the tip is, right? So the body is able to sense the fine end effector of this. And this ability is foundational for all our tool using abilities, our ability to use a cane or for multiple things. We just can't function without this ability. So traditional perspective would be that you have some receptors in the hand, which are basically which are showing activity in certain pattern, and brain is interpreting that. But what we have shown in one of the experiments which I did during my PhD, which is not part of my thesis, but outside and published with Damien Celtic Steven, is that it's not just the hand, it's the whole body. And when you are asking people to stand on a force plate, and you record ground reaction forces and you record their body movements, there are signatures of this perception all across your body, as well as in the ground reaction forces which you record from force plates. And the flow of certain kind of flow, you can call it like a flow of fluctuations across different body parts. The better or worse it is across different joints contributes to how accurate the perception is, which is very counterintuitive. And it kind of shows that body is like a holistic organ, which works as a unison rather than perception happening at a particular, place. So that's one of it. And there are several themes around where like there's little evidence. Science progresses, one small finding at a time. So
Yes,
there's a
no,
lot
of
to do.
course, yes.
Yeah.
So there's a whole, one might say, flood of information coming
Yeah.
from the entire body. And in this case, more information, you're arguing, is better. It enriches the perception.
Across certain body parts. Across some body parts, we found that it was actually hampering the perception. So it depends, yeah. But what is important is that it's not like a single point. It's a flow across parts, which contributes to our
see.
perceptual abilities.
So it's important, I guess, scientifically to be able to say to a questioner with good intentions, it's not something kind of trivial like, oh, just more data is better. That's not the case. That's not the case at all. Do you think that those ground reaction forces you're picking up are being sensed by the lower limb and used, or are those just kind of epiphenomena, so to speak? They're reactions to the torques and forces.
I think it's both. It's both. Because I mean, we know so much about physiology now that it's not just the central origin in terms of controlling the posture. It's also how you stand influences how you move.
Yes, of course.
And when you look at the later experiments we did, with different kind of postural tasks, again, we found that there were influences of subtle fluctuations in posture in the ability to do things. And we are not the only people,
Yes.
right? Like there have been groups which have found different influences of posture on different suprapostural activities.
Right.
So the basic idea we are moving is in trying to study hand and manual dexterity, not from the manual perspective, but from a suprapostural perspective. So for instance, current experiments in the lab, we have people, I'll just give you an example. The current project, one of the largest in the lab, is looking at people are standing on force plate, just a stable force plate, or they're standing on a balance board, which is very difficult to balance. And while they are standing on a balance board, they're also making a trail with the laser with the laser pointer on a big screen. And it's a random numbers, right? So people are able to trace about 30 to 40 numbers in that 5-minute duration while they're maintaining the balance. And then we are recording the whole body kinematics, and we are doing a network analysis on the body and see how different body parts form different modules, and the modules interact while they're trying to stabilize this task. So we have the eye tracking data, we have the marker data, we have the kinematic data and the ground reaction forces. So once we have that kind of data set, we can actually talk about these two-way interactions where we can do modeling not just from ground reaction forces to perception, but also what happens to your perceptual performance and how that influences your posture in the next segment.
That's very ingenious.
Yeah.
Could I ask a kind of a neurology-centered question? If you were to test, going back to just standing on a stable force
Yeah.
platform while doing the dynamic touch task, do you think that people with sensory neuropathy of the feet, I think it's a Romberg sign or something like that, would they, if you can be sure that they are otherwise okay in terms of the upper extremity and torso, would you predict that they would do worse on dynamic touch
Actually, there is
while
work.
while standing? Yeah.
I'm not sure. So while seating, we have some evidence. I think there's one article by Claudio Carrello where they found people with basically no sense of the skin or no perception, only muscular sense is available, and they are able to wield. Of course, they wield with the over or underestimate, but they're able to identify the properties of the objects fairly accurately within participant.
Yes.
With standing, uh, there's a recent work which points towards the contribution of things like fascia, for instance, and the whole body integrity. And we have been underestimating the whole body integrity, over sensor-based thinking.
Yes.
So it might be that people who do have neuropathy but are able to maintain stable posture
Yes.
might be actually they might show they might have lower performance, or they might take more time.
Yes.
But within that time, they might have a decently coordinated pattern,
Yes.
even though they might not have, a full-scale sensory reception from the lower limb. But it's a great question, and also something one should study.
Well, of course, and
Yeah.
it's related to medical applications,
Yeah.
and which I assume you're very interested in, and also robotic
Assistance,
implications.
yeah.
Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah, and it is fairly more common. I mean, people with peripheral arterial disease will also have similar kind of, and diabetic neuropathy will have.
Right.
It's a big chunk of population as well, which suffers through these kind of issues.
What department are you in?
So I'm in the Department of Biomechanics,
Yes.
and it's one of the few or probably the only biomechanics department, because normally we have bioengineering departments or
Yes.
kinesiology and movement sciences departments. And Nick Sturgio, whose brainchild the department is, he wanted a biomechanics department. So about 9 years back, they established a department. I would love to have you come here. Probably I'll invite you for the seminar series soon. So it's like a Disneyland for human movement research or human research. So
Wonderful.
it's a young department, and we have almost all facilities to study human movements and physiology, and really great labs to do these kind of full body tracking experiments.
That's very, very exciting. Oh gosh, so much promise and potential in you and I guess your colleagues. It's great. That's great. Yeah. Well, terrific. When did you start? I'll just ask you a couple more questions if I may.
Sure, of course.
Just so I can get to know you, and also, to the extent that I know you better, I might be able to tailor remarks to your interest. And that is this podcast series. Why did you start it? When did you start it? Why did you call it BeyondPhrenology? Those are things I've wondered about.
Yeah, so I started this in I think June 2023. And Louis Favela, who is my friend and philosopher. By the way, when I say somebody, my friend, most likely I've never met them. Okay. So he's at University of Central Florida. He's a philosopher and a regular contributor to my book collection and stuff like that. So he was okay. So a little before. So why I started? I think I was kind of saturated with writing papers and doing research, because it's fun and I love it. But at the same time, you have this need to have this conversation. So I grew up, with a fantasy about science, reading books by people like Feynman. And I always wondered that I would be in a research environment where, there's like science in the corridors and, basically like everything is just revolves around science, drinking around science, everything around science. The old MIT, the old, Los Alamos and, that kind of a moment. But things have changed. You would have seen things changing within your career as well, the way academics work. So we have different constraints now, different kind of pressures, and less casual interactions about science and much more less strategic and more tactical kind of conversations on an everyday basis. So I was lacking that interaction with people, and with
Yes.
publications are fine to put up what you want and back and forth with the reviews. But some things which you really want to know from the people who actually came up with those theories. So for instance, I had a podcast with Professor Mark Latash, and some things he made clear which never got clear even while reading his books and his text, right? So there's something about humans interacting, in person, even though, across the screen, that brings out that thing. So one of the motivations was, to have those conversations in science, to rock the boat a little bit once in a while. And then it's also a great resource, for my students and for newcomers, in the field.
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely. Yeah.
that was the second motivation, to create like a resource over time,
That's
which one can
wonderful.
refer to.
And so you do these on average, with what frequency? How often?
So I plan to have one a week, but
Wow.
it's a lot of work because
Sure. Yeah.
starting from invitation to scheduling, and then finally it takes several hours of post-processing. So this is the 27th episode. So I'm a
Wow.
little behind on that, once a week schedule, but I'm growing it organically. So I don't ask people to subscribe or like. I don't advertise other than posting on a regular post on LinkedIn. So it's growing naturally, and I think the audience size right now I have 135 subscribers, and most of them are like scientists and PhD students. That's what my prime audience is. So yeah, so I'm doing it more for my fun and as a resource than actually, for numbers. So moving in that way.
Zoom has really enabled a huge amount of communication.
Yes.
So I will share with you, I will put you on my lab email list and anybody else who might want that. So my lab meets every week for 2 hours. And I would say once every 3 weeks on average. The entire time is devoted to a speaker from outside. And it affords, I'm just repeating what you said, Mutter. It just affords conversation and often stimulates collaborations. And yeah, we need to talk to each other. And ironically, I mean, a kind of a gift from the pandemic, ironically,
Yeah.
is that people do this, and we actually could have without the pandemic, but somehow, ironically, the pandemic kind of legitimized this in
Yeah.
a certain way. So I will certainly put you on our list, and um, you're most welcome to participate. Now, we are cognitive psychologists, and so you might bristle at some of the things we assume, but well, we can get into that if you
Yeah,
want
of
to.
course.
Yeah.
No, that's very kind, and I'll look forward to interact with you more.
Anyway, again, I
Yeah.
want to just say hats off to you for
Yeah.
doing this. I think it's great. And it's Beyond Phrenology.
Yes. So
I think I
so
know why, but it's a great
yeah. So
name.
so when I moved to Nebraska, last year actually, later part of 2022, somehow I missed reading the work of William Uttal. William Uttal was a psychologist at Arizona State University, ASU. And my colleague Aaron Likens, Dr. Aaron Likens, who is also an assistant professor, and we work together, introduced me to William Uttal, Professor William Uttal, and I started reading his books. So I know, like, I mean, you would share some issues, I have with neuroscience, especially the idea that you can localize causes in the brain or privileging the brain over the body disproportionately. And the idea that you can, so phrenology, we all know, was like a science, as it shows. It's a poster of a phrenological journal. And
Right.
the idea that, brain has different parts and different parts are responsible for different skills and abilities. And once you can look at the shape of a person's brain and
Right.
tell whether they are, good or bad with that ability. And for instance, this is published by Fowlers and Wills publishers from New York in 1850. And this was a well-established science at that time.
Sure.
Now, when we look back, we kind of laugh at it. Or at least we understand that people are doing it by with a good thought, but maybe it was misguided. We don't know. But so I feel that there's a very similar thing going on with neuroscience now. Uh, so not to be condescending to certain kind of neuroscience, but we have a lot of make-believe neuroscience in the sense that we believe a lot of things about brain as a fundamental truth, and based on that we build these theories and castles and invest a lot of resources into that, like billions actually, in terms of what neurons do or what different parts of the brain do. And the idea of the podcast was that to talk about things which uh, provides argument from the other side, provide evidence that that might not be a good assumption, and probably there's more which the mainstream neuroscience lacks, and also to promote what is there. For instance, the ecological approaches, the dynamical systems approaches, move beyond localization. So the idea is, so although it refers to the phrenology, the old phrenological science, but the idea is a little to just be radical about localization, and it might be a different field. It can be an idea in economics as well, which I've not delved into. Because whenever we're talking about complex system, it's a good idea not to localize. So that's the theme of the podcast.
Great.
Yeah.
Wish you luck with it. And thank you
Thank
for
you.
allowing me to turn the tables a little bit, but it's just out of respect and to give you a chance.
No, I very much appreciate your
So thank you.
admiration. Yeah.
Thanks for the detour, but it's very welcome. It's
Yeah.
good.
And then I also heard from a lot of my audience that, we don't know who you are. So, and some other people who have advised me to, at least introduce yourself. So thanks a lot for having this
And
opportunity for me.
actually, we are
Yeah.
human beings. So this is also a reflection of me a little bit,
Yeah.
but not to get personal, but in terms of who you are, who are you aside from all that work stuff you just talked about? Or are you, this is it?
I mean,
You have
okay.
hobbies or things
So
like that?
I'm a very boring looking, very interesting person, I would say. So people who know me, they say that my life is a movie, and people who don't know me, who just see me working or outside, they think that I'm the most boring person on earth. So a lot of thing goes, in my background in my life. So as you said, right, I don't get proper sleep. I don't have a circadian rhythm. So I'm always doing something. You know, so that's that. Uh, so I'm originally from India. I did my master's and bachelor's there. I wanted to be an engineer, but accidentally came into science because I did not know the difference between science and engineering. And as far as I started my career, I was not happy with the world. I was like a whiny, radical, uh, communist kid of 21 years old. And I wanted to leave humanity and spend my life in a forest. So I started watching this movie called Into the Wild, which I've watched about 150 times within a semester. But in India, forest, you're not allowed to go in forest, especially the reserved ones where you actually have wild animals. You need to have permissions for that. So just to go in a forest and live there, I applied to a professor who is a wildlife ecologist and evolutionary biologist.
Uh-huh.
And with him, I started working on monkeys, and he had been a big influence on me, um, both with his sense of humor and his intellect and his work. And he's kind of my grandfather now. So, so I
And
moved to.
his name is what?
His name is Professor Meva Singh. He's a very accomplished professor at a small university in India, who is almost your age. Always, even now, he is mostly found in his office on his projects. He just loves what he does. So he had been a profound influence along with other mentors. And I started working on monkeys, and that's when I discovered your work, and I
And you
found
have published on capuchins.
yeah. So from there,
Yeah.
I got interested in work. I wanted to be on National Geographic or Animal Planet. That was my childhood dream because I grew up watching that. So I contacted Professor Dori Fragesi, who I used to cite. So I used to cite a lot of papers by Fragesi and Wieselbergy, and I was lucky that she took me as a PhD student. And there I worked with her in Brazil, and then interest kept changing with colleagues and with infusion of information, with colleagues and other professors, and things evolved. Other than science, I love literature and reading in general. So I do read a lot of literature, and I like working on machine tools. So technology, machines, tools. So I can open basically a whole motorcycle and put it back together. I'm not doing this a lot these days, but that's the
That's
second thing I like.
that's very good for me to know. If I ever have a car breakdown in Omaha, I'll be in touch with you.
Sure, not the new ones, but your old mechanical systems.
Um,
And these days, academics is very consuming. So since I've taken the faculty position, or I mean, even later part of the postdoc, I have lesser and lesser time for the things, and
yes, sure.
with the family responsibilities at home. So those things
So
consume
you
time.
have a family at home.
I am alone, but I have my parents who I take care. So I often go back and with health issues and everything that consumes.
Exactly. Understood. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
So basically, these days, that's all that is happening.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's great. All right.
So thanks, Professor Rosenbaum. And
Sure.
coming back to your work, which by the way, for people, I would recommend Professor Rosenbaum is coming up with a book right now. It is in press, and he sent me a sneak peek. It's called Cognitive Control of Action, and it's a highly recommended book for two reasons. First of all, for those who want to know more about Professor David Rosenbaum, or in general for young people to know how the career trajectory of a scientist by heart goes. So that book is a really good primer. So you start with your experience there, right? As your from your first project to what motivated you moving towards the next finding and next study, and how that contributed to your career, and you move places and work with different people. So it's a really great introduction there, and as well as the content of the book, the selected work from your lifetime of research.
May I just,
Yeah,
in case it's not clear for anybody who might be listening, so the subtitle of it is the whatever collected works of so and so.
yeah,
So I would never in a million years have sat down and written a whole long autobiography and put together various papers. So I was very, very, very honored to get an invitation to contribute to this world series of psychology, which has surprisingly few people represented. So it's kind of a collected works
yeah,
sort of book. And so because well, I think, yeah, to just write about oneself uh, and just put in one's own works is I would stay away from anybody like that. I'd stay far away from them. But I was sort of invited, and they said, "Please do this," so I
yeah.
complied.
No, it's a really great introduction, especially when somebody has read a lot of your work and you want to know, how the transition from one particular idea went to the next, and how it was influential also, in changing the career. So I think it's very informative. It's
Thank you very
Yeah.
much. Yeah.
So Professor Azman, would you like to just give a brief on your career? So you started with a PhD at Stanford. And you also worked in Bell Labs at that time, where Bell Labs used to be a place where a lot of good work used to happen. And then you talked about, the funding issues, the Bell Lab for basic research. So definitely you were more interested in basic research than applied. And then you moved to, Hampshire College, and from there to other places. So I know that you have been a professor at 10 plus universities, like visiting professor across the world. But some milestones you would like to walk us and the audience.
Well, I can do that. Let me just before I do that, I'm happy to say that, but I think it would be useful to say, okay, this guy you've got here, like, okay, what did he show? So let me talk about
Yeah.
the main things that I think the lab has shown, because who cares where I worked?
Okay.
It doesn't really matter. So first of all, well, I'll say this. When I was a undergraduate student at Swarthmore College outside of Philadelphia. I'm from Philadelphia, but Swarthmore was about an hour and a half from where my parents lived, so that was that was good. I um, fell in love with the idea that one could attempt to understand the human mind through party games called psychology experiments. That is still what I love the most. The idea that through very simple, hopefully, behavioral observations, one can stumble upon maybe some new insights into the workings of the mind. And that idea has continued to captivate me. I have not gone the route of imaging or EEG or EMG. I think that is to some extent a luxury I have of being a more senior person with tenure and so forth. But I continue to be really struck by the power of behavioral observation and then the discoveries that come from them. So if I could, if you want, we can come back to places I worked and all that sort of stuff. So you mentioned something called the end state comfort effect. For those who don't know what that is, and I'd like to maybe just mention various phenomena, because that's, as scientists, that's what matters. What did you discover? What's the elevator talk?
Yeah.
And so-called end state comfort effect. So one day, I was eating lunch at a pretty nice restaurant. I don't know why it was such a fancy restaurant, but there I was having lunch with my wife. This was a white tablecloth. I guess it was some wedding anniversary. I don't know what it was. I saw on the other side of the restaurant a waiter who I guess had been given the assignment to fill a whole bunch of glasses with water. And so on his white tablecloth, there were a whole bunch of inverted glasses, very nice, goblets. Each one was upside down. And I'll take advantage of the camera here on Zoom. Out of the corner of my eye, so to speak, I saw the waiter grab each glass like that.
Yeah.
Way down on the table, my hands up near my face so I can show it. He would grab it, turn it over, pour the water in, and then set the glass down. Then he'd grab the next glass, doing this very awkward maneuver. Well, my eyeballs escaped their sockets at that moment. I went like that. I'm interested in cognition and action. And here, in an ecological context, was somebody violating, in a way, the most common, the most typical way of grabbing a glass and lifting a glass, which of course canonically would be thumb up and then you drink it. And here he's doing this very odd thing. And that just struck me and impressed me because it's, roughly speaking, a planning phenomenon. One might say it's picking up on a certain affordance, but defined with respect not to the immediate task of, grabbing the object and lifting it, but with respect to something farther down the line, the state that he would be in later. And as you know, Madhur and others may know, there's a well-known phenomenon in speech called co-articulation. And that's been studied extensively in the speech production community by Carol Fowler, among others, where the way a sound is produced is influenced by what sound needs to be produced next.
Right.
And that's really very exciting, isn't it? It clearly rules out any simple-minded notion where all we do is react to what has just occurred before. There is some kind of, I'll dare to say, a representation of what's to come later and some kind of modification or adjustment accordingly. And here we had an example in manual behavior, in prehension, that was kind of analogous to what one sees in speech. So I kind of naively called this the end state comfort effect, because it sure looked like what people are doing there. And indeed, this was confirmed in laboratory experiments, as you know. There is a very pronounced tendency to get into final manual postures defined principally with respect to rotation about the arm. This is the jargon is pronation and supination. Supine means lying down. When you get into bed at night, you're supine. You know this. I'm speaking to students. Well, there's a very strong tendency, really strong tendency, for people to put themselves into kind of awkward, uncomfortable positions for the sake of ending in a more comfortable position. It turns out that it's not just that everyone is puritanical and wants to delay gratification as much as possible. It turns out, in fact, that in the middle of the range of the pronation supination axis, you have the most power in the mid-range. You can make finer adjustments there. And in some research that our lab has published, we showed that in the middle of the range of motion, oscillation frequencies are higher than way out at the edges. That was a 1996 paper. And in studies where we had people just reach out to grab a handle and turn it in order to aim it to a final position, it turns out that depending on the required precision at the end versus the beginning, there are very predictable changes in the grasp that are used. So it's actually not really about comfort, it's about control. And what people seem to be doing is that they're modulating their initial grasps of objects to maximize the probability of having good control when it's most needed, which for the tasks I described happen to be at the end of the main task, like pouring water into it. And so that so-called end state comfort effect has gotten a fair amount of attention. It's been studied in primates and in monkeys and in lemurs.
Yeah.
Show it. Elderly in children and neuroatypical population. So that was just a simple observation, which helped kind of confirm that initial naive belief I had as a college student, that from simple behavior it might be possible to learn interesting things. Now, I could tell you about another phenomenon that has occupied us a great deal in the past several years. And this one is kind of quite a bit removed from biomechanics and motor control in ways I never expected. By the way, I got interested in motor control as a cognitive psychologist because when I was a graduate student, so I'll sort of weave together the autobiography. So I was an undergraduate at Swarthmore College, and then I went to Stanford to work on memory, which was a great privilege to be able to go. And when I got to Stanford and became steeped in cognitive psychology, I noticed something. Well, we always notice things. What is it that I noticed that there was a huge amount of attention being directed to perception. That's fine. It's very important. To attention, to learning, to storing things away in memory. All very important, for sure. Very important. But you know what wasn't being studied and had never really been studied very much by cognitive psychologists? And that was, as you know, Mathur, it was just, how do we organize physical activity? And this just hit me in that collected works intro. I said that was the most important thing I ever discovered, just realizing that in everything we do in our lives, we are endlessly expressing vast amounts of knowledge that we have. And I invite anyone who is at all predisposed or disposed in this direction simply to use your eyes, watch people in their kitchens, in their dining rooms, in stores, and marvel at something that it takes a bit of a trained eye to even notice. I'll give an example, and this will be a lead into this next phenomenon. So one day at home, where we had a big dining room table, and there was nothing on it except a glass somewhere on the table. And I wasn't thinking about research at all, but I did something which, after the fact, made me stop and think about what I had just done. And what did I do? Well, I walked around the table in order to grab the glass. That's no big deal. However, I could have, I'm tall enough, my arm is long enough, I could have gone to the edge of the table, leaned across the table to get the glass. Again, I wasn't thinking about any of this. I walked all the way around and made a quick and easy lift. Whereupon I kind of said to myself, whoa, that's, everybody does that. There's nothing special there. There was some kind of calculation, computation, some sort of internal decision-making whereby, as in, Bernstein's degrees of freedom problem, with multiple ways of achieving something, my nervous system settled on some particular method that was better I guess, than reaching across. So I brought that into the laboratory and decided to study it. And we brought this into the laboratory, and just to anticipate, and you may not be aware of this, and that's fine. What we found led to a New York Times article about the research, another New York Times article, articles in The Guardian and Le Monde and German newspapers, and it spawned a lot of research. It's a phenomenon that I called pre-crastination.
Yeah.
And
you are still working on that.
oh
I
yes,
noticed. Yes.
so maybe I can tell
Yeah.
about pre-crastination. Uh, uh, the word is, as anyone with an ear can tell, it's the opposite, roughly, of procrastination.
Yeah.
Procrastination, as we all know, and forgive me now, Madhur, as I show you what I do when I teach.
Yeah.
Procrastination is, as we all know, the tendency to, sorry, I like to make jokes when I teach. It's
great.
the tendency to,
Yeah.
okay, I'm being very silly. And the tendency to put off for as long as possible. That's what procrastination is.
Yeah.
And procrastination is a really big problem for many people, and a big problem in society, actually. It is thought, if it is carried out to extreme degrees in people, to be quite maladaptive and counterproductive and hurtful. But a lot of people are trapped into that. Anyway, based on some research inspired by the home observation of walking around a table to pick up an object, in our lab, we discovered a very odd behavioral tendency, which led to our proposal that there is, I'll say it strongly, there is a behavioral or psychological tendency that is as marked demographically, at least in weird societies like ours. So people, I guess, know what what does it stand for? Western educated.
Western educated.
In something rich.
Yeah. Yeah, R is rich.
I don't know.
D, I think, is yeah, let me just spell it out.
Whatever.
Yeah, it's Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. Yeah.
All right. Well, hopefully, if the next election goes okay, we will stay weird in the United States. I'm worried about the Democratic Party. Anyway, at least in weird societies, there seems to be a very, very strong tendency to precrastinate, not to put off as long as possible, but actually to work very hard to get things done as soon as we possibly can. Now, that sounds almost like pop psychology. It is about a broad range of behavior. We can give instances, and maybe then circle back to the biomechanically inspired experiment that led to this, which is if there's any lesson to be learned here, or for people to think about, is how something that's ostensibly very, very tiny, uninteresting, that if you let yourself look in a really open way, to be open to the possibility that in a grain of sand one can see the world, as I guess William Blake wrote in poetry. There's a lot there. So some real world examples of precrastination.
Yeah.
which in retrospect are completely obvious. It just happens that they're now being put under one umbrella, are getting an email and thinking, okay, I'm going to respond to this right away. And I really need to get up and go, but I just want to get this damn thing done.
I have that tendency.
Well, most of us
Think-
do. Most of us do.
Yeah.
Well, people like you
Yeah.
who are accomplished and conscientious and, and why, why do you do that? I'll ask you. I won't
I
ask
think
you.
I think we feel good, in terms of like ourselves, if our executive memory in quotes is like empty and free. We don't like things in our executive memory. So anything that hampers thinking, I feel we want to get rid of this from the plate.
Yeah.
And
That's
it ties also in the end state comfort kind of idea a little bit.
and how so? I'd love to hear your
Uh,
thought about that.
I mean, it's a little pain for, so a lot of these things and are boring, boring, and I mean they're not very productive. They don't reward you for your prime motivation, right? But you know that these are hurdles to your prime motivation. Until the time they are, your concentration or your ability to work towards your prime motivation is hampered.
Yes,
So
exactly.
you are very highly motivated to clear the deck, to move to things which you are primarily motivated for.
That's right. Yes,
So
I
it's
think
it's
so.
it's some kind of a little discomfort. And this is what I wanted to comment, when you discussed end state comfort. And end state comfort, we look, in the physical sense, in this particular example, and you yourself mentioned, it works at all time scales. One can, it's part of a theme of how the brain functions probably, and not just limited to movement. Uh, Movement is just one manifestation. It might be that that's where it's more prominent. Uh,
Yes. Yes. There's certainly nothing about the definition of end state
yeah,
comfort
yeah,
that says it needs to be limited to manual performance. Yeah,
right.
absolutely. But I think your account of why people answer emails ASAP is right on the money. And empirically, I think I can share some data with you,
Of
some
course, I would
reports
love to
about
hear
that.
that.
Yes, no, this is wonderful. Okay, well, to close the loop a little bit, I started out by saying that, very unremarkably, I walked the long way around a table to pick up a glass. Totally trivial, everyday observation. And
Yeah,
then it kind of leads to this, pre-crastination idea. So we embarked in our lab on a range of experiments in which we looked at the relative costs of reaching over different distances versus walking over different distances. And the idea is that in decision making about actions, precisely because there are multiple dimensions on which actions vary, one has to make decisions implicitly, I suppose, about what the weights are going to be for those different aspects. So in the case I just described, implicitly, that is unconsciously, I elected to walk far in order to reach near, right?
yeah,
So somehow these two kinds of amplitudes were contrasted. And by the way, that's my
I can see.
wife back there, hello, Professor Judith Kroll,
Hello,
who's at the University of California, Irvine. And this
good afternoon. Yeah,
Judy, a couple of years ago, was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences.
I noticed that. Yes,
And I'm so very proud of Judy.
yeah.
Um,
And you have been, I think together since like probably your PhD or maybe even before that.
We got married in 76,
Yeah.
PhD in 77.
Yeah.
So it's been a long and wonderful blessing
It is.
for me. Okay, so yeah, we did a number of studies in which we asked people to make very simple choices, which are essentially analogous to the the thing in the dining room. You could either reach far and walk near, or and so on and so forth. We could vary all those things, get psychometric curves, and so on and so forth. Okay, so along with two students when I was at Penn State at the time. So yeah, I'll just to weave the two. So Swarthmore College, Stanford University, and then I worked at Bell Labs Murray Hill in Saul Sternberg's Human Information Processing Department. The total antithesis of Mike Turvey style
Yes.
Gibsonian stuff. By the way, if you remember later, I have some remarks that I thought I might share about Gibson later on, if you want to.
Of course, of course, of course. I'm
Remind
very
me.
interested. Yeah.
Whom I respect, and of course, this podcast is very pro Gibson. I'm pro Gibson too, but
Yeah.
anyway, and then so yeah, Judy was at Rutgers Newark, and a lot of people got cancer there, and she had to quit.
You mentioned
And
that.
so I mentioned it in that book, yeah.
Yeah.
And then so we looked for jobs. Judy went to Mount Holyoke College, and I went to Hampshire College, which are very close to each other. Bill Warren had gone to Hampshire College. He and I are about the same age, so he was there well before I became a teacher there. One of the students I had at Hampshire College was a guy named Gary Marcus, who has become one of the leading lights on AI and so forth, developmental psychology. And I'm sure that Gary would have done wonderfully without me in his career. I went to UMass for a number of years, and then Penn State for 22 years, and then Judy and I moved to California. So that's that business. So at Penn State, along with two students, Corey Potts and Lan Yun Gong, who's gone back to China, we set up an experiment that was published in 2014 in Psychological Science, and this was the pre-crastination paper. And I think the experiment will hopefully make sense to you, Madhur, as a biomechanist. Incidentally, in much the same way that you in your research are, interested in kind of new forms of data than are traditionally studied. I am a complete weirdo in cognitive psychology because I'm interested in cognitive psychology and biomechanics. Actually, I'm very interested in that because we all know biomechanics better than biomechanists do. We manifest it all the time. And this whole idea of deep implicit knowledge is absolutely fascinating. So consider the following biomechanics problem. It's the one that we presented to undergraduates at Penn State University. And again, you probably know the experiment I'm speaking to,
Of course, the large
never
audience,
heard. So you're a participant in the psychology experiment, you sign the informed consent, all that kind of stuff. You're trying to get your credits for intro psych. And you stand at the foot of an alleyway, long alleyway in front of you, like 16 feet long. And to one side, along the left edge of the alley, there's a bar stool on which stands a beach bucket. And along the right side, right edge, there's another bar stool that has a different beach bucket. And there's nothing special about these beach buckets. In one of the experiments where it gets sort of most interesting, both buckets have 7 pounds of pennies. 7 pounds of pennies is heavy, actually. And you get to use dynamic touch and wield them and pick up the inertia tensors and feel these guys, and they're not being, surreptitiously taken away. They're just sitting there. And in different conditions of the experiment, we varied the positions of the left and right bucket. And the task, the party game, is it's just the following. Please just walk down the alley, pick up either bucket, either the left one with your left hand, just pick it up and just while walking, and put it on a table at the end of the alley, or walk along and if you choose, pick up the right bucket, the one on the right stool with your right hand. Just walk along, pick it up and put it down. And then come on back and the research assistant will set up the next trial for you. Okay. Now, we did this experiment being pretty sure that we would get data that would be maybe a nice, respectable kind of experiment. It might appear in some journal and get a little curve, and we could try to explain. Actually, what we were heading for, Madhur, is an experiment in which, pardon me, there'd be a very light bucket, empty bucket, versus a bucket with a lot of weight. And our question that we were working towards is this, which is, well, if you had a choice between carrying a light bucket a long way versus a heavy bucket a short way.
Yeah, which one would you choose?
Which would you pick? Which would you pick? I mean, would you walk 20 miles with a very light bucket rather than, 8 feet with a very heavy bucket? No, you're not going to walk that much. That's the idea. So we would trade off these things. But just as in preparation for that experiment, we said, let's just try it with, equal weight buckets, because for sure, we just want to make sure our procedure is good. For sure, people will pick up the bucket that's closer to the end.
Yeah.
That makes sense. You don't have to work so hard. Okay. So let's just run that experiment just to be sure, Well, first subject came in. We explained it all very clearly. We said there are no trapdoors, no tricks, nothing. And we said, do whatever you think is easier. All right. Well, as you know, I'll just say it this way. God had a surprise for us because person after person picked up the bucket that was closer to them rather than the bucket that was farther from them. And that meant that they picked up the bucket that had to be carried further rather than the bucket that had to be carried less far.
So,
go ahead.
So the economy was not about the task, the economy was about the decision making.
Well, yes, that's a very elegant way of putting it. But let me just say that before we got to that, you just stated it so elegantly. I think more elegantly than I've ever said it. But I should say that our first interpretation was, and this is my go-to hypothesis, because it's very often in my life proven to be correct, which
Yeah.
is I screwed up. I did something wrong. The
Yeah.
instructions were unclear. Something was wrong. Something was not
Yeah.
right. Now, before the experiment, I had a full head of hair. But when we got the data from subject, I said, what is going on here? Okay, not really, but we could
Right.
not figure it out. It didn't make sense. So we did experiment after experiment. We used a wheelchair where we wheeled people down. We thought maybe it had to do with coordinating the hands and the feet
Yeah.
because it's a non-trivial thing to do. And maybe it's easier to just plan one or two little pitty patter steps and pick up the object and go than to have to kind of plan it out. It's same thing with wheelchairs, all kinds of things. 9 experiments, the same basic result is replicated over and over and over. And the interpretation we gave for it finally was, you've said it so beautifully. It's not about the physical task, it's about the decision making. And what participants said to us was, we said to them finally, why did you pick up the near bucket? And the answer was this funny statement, which was, I just wanted to get it done as soon as I could.
Right.
Now, in a later experiment, we actually timed the carries. They're no different, doesn't matter.
So even if you like increase the distance a lot between the two buckets, it's still
well, there have to be some limits. There surely are limits, and certainly for a very heavy weight. I mean, a thought experiment
yeah.
would be 100-pound sack of potatoes that has to be carried a long way. Go
You know,
ahead.
I observe this every time when I actually navigate. So for instance, Omaha is a great city, right? And I go to a cafe in downtown very often. And there are multiple ways, right? Bernstein's degrees of freedom. You can go from my home, you can go like this, or you
Yes,
can go this, or you can
yes,
go through blocks like this, right? My
yes,
tendency is always to first make the decision so that I'm
right.
parallel to that cafe, you know, and then walk straight on the road. I don't like a lot of decisions to be made, and I mostly take that turn much closer to my home, you know, that detour than
Beautiful.
actually than the cafe.
That's a beautiful example. Yes,
Yeah.
that's been mentioned before. Actually, in the psych science paper, we
Yeah.
have an anecdote about about the first editor of Psychological Science, William K. Estes, who did that with somebody. It's a little footnote. But
Yeah.
yes, thank you so much for mentioning it. Yes, there's no a priori reason why you should, make the turn as soon as possible, but it's for this reason.
Yeah.
It's for this reason. Wonderful. So we kind of brought this to the attention of our society, our scientific community. And there's a beautiful kind of replication extension of this task that was invented by Lisa Fournier at Washington State University. And Lisa organized a whole experiment. I was lucky enough to be one of the co-authors. And I'd like to tell you about that one too. It's in a way a much simpler task than the one I've described for you. Again, it involved a long alleyway. And then again, it involved 2 bar stools and 2 buckets. What Lisa did was she had one stool with a bucket right in front of you and another stool with a bucket farther beyond it, farther along. And you would stand there, you see these 2 buckets, and you know how heavy they are. They're filled, I think, with tennis balls or something. And she says, please go out there and fetch the buckets. Come back with both buckets.
Hmm.
Now, if you think about this for a moment, you realize that there are two different categorical possibilities for how one might do this task. One way that kind of makes a lot of sense, I think energetically, is walk past the first bucket, go out there, pick up the far one, come back with your other hand empty, and then pick up the near bucket. And you're shaking your head because you see immediately what, in fact, about 3/4 of the participants did this very odd thing, which is they would pick up the near bucket, they would carry it with them, get the other bucket, and come back. They have picked up and carried that near bucket all the way out and all the way back.
Yeah.
And for the same reason, it's under the aegis, we think, of wanting to get an irritating little thing on your head over and done with. And go ahead.
I would say it's probably, I was suddenly started thinking about from an evolutionary perspective, because the whole idea of reaching and grasping, given that it originated with picking fruits and food, right? When you are in the wild for a monkey, if there are two mangoes, one here and one later, by the time you come back, the mango might not be there because some other monkey would have picked. So generally speaking, if I have to do some manual action, I would try to. So do you think that might be
I think it's certainly possible. And, I think Lisa and I and others have talked a little bit about varying the kind of the affective valence of the object and so forth. On the other hand, as you said earlier, and you're certainly right as far as I can tell, which is that, there's not a huge amount of, I don't know, emotional payoff from, picking up
buckets,
an early bucket. But I hear you, and it may be based on this for sure. But the other thing that Lisa did and I did was we followed up with an experiment where another group of participants had a memory load, and they were asked to memorize some items while standing at the home position, then go out and fetch the buckets, and then come back with the buckets, and then they had to recall. Well, if making the early decision, pre-crastinating, picking up the near bucket, carrying it out, coming back, if that's about ridding your mind of an extra memory load, then one would expect that with a memory load imposed, there should be an even stronger tendency to pre-crastinate. And indeed, the data very strongly supported that we got that result. Lisa got that result. And I think it's a very, very clever demonstration. So there's this phenomenon where, when I talk to people, a lot of people say, and I've collected many, many examples here. Some are pretty strange. One that sticks with me is, well, I'll share two of them. If I can keep track of them. One is, people have been interested in the work. They've talked to me. They said, so-and-so said, my sister is so much like this. She did her tax returns and put them in an envelope and did that and finished it on a Sunday morning. And it needed to be put in a post office delivery slot. No, it didn't. I'm sorry, it didn't have to be. But there was a post office open, something like an hour and a half away from where she lived.
Yeah.
And so she needed to get uh, she didn't want to put it in the mailbox or in the local
Oh,
post
I
office.
see. I see.
She wanted to get it over and done
Yeah.
with, and she drove for 3 hours that day.
Right.
Now, that's odd behavior. Another example that is not quite so crazy sounding, it's a colleague of mine, I won't name her, a wonderful, a full professor in my department. She shared with me that because of procrastination, she told me, she said, David, I have to tell you about this very amusing thing I did, which was that she had her annual sexual abuse training thing that she had to do. You know, all of us, you have to do it at your university, and right, every year or something like that. Okay, she had to do it, and she kept getting these notices that, you know, it would be coming due, let's just say for sake of the January 1st. And she just wanted to get it over and done with. And she knew that if she did it now, something like 6 weeks before it was due, the clock would reset.
Yeah.
And so a year from now, she would start getting these reminders in November because it's due in December. She knew that, but she just needed to get this over and done with. So these are some amusing examples that I think belie what can be, in other cases, far more serious, where people, for example, rush to have surgeries that maybe they don't really need. There's a rush to judgment in cases where criminal cases are decided as soon as possible to get them done with, and so forth. So there's another, just one more thing on procrastination.
Yeah.
And that is that someone named Lisa Vangsness and her advisor when she was at the University of Kansas kept track of when psychology students came into the lab to complete their experiment participation requirement for intro psych credit.
Yeah.
And the question was, when during the semester did students do that? And they kept track of this over many semesters. So they had a huge sample here, I think like almost 2,000 people. Well, if you look at the statistical distribution, it's trimodal. There are a bunch of people, about 20% of the population are procrastinators. They all do it at the very end.
Yeah.
Yeah, the last week of the semester. Another 20, about 40% are kind of spread, kind of like a random distribution throughout. And another 20%, so the same proportion, same percent as procrastinators, reliably get it done as soon as they can. So this tendency to procrastinate seems to be, you know, very, very common. And just actually one last thing.
Yeah.
Neither you nor I are in the field of personality research. I have suddenly, a humble motor control psychologist finds himself hanging out with these personality researchers. So now there's research on personality, and there seems to be a bona fide trait for procrastination. It's not just, you know, the opposite of it's not just that if you're not they're orthogonal.
Right.
Based on various statistical
So several thoughts here. So you know, my own example here. When I was in school, I never did my homework at home. So I either stayed at school itself, you know, a few more minutes or hours, doing my homework and then go home, or I would finish those patches of work, within 2 class periods or things like that, or even recess. I would not go out to eat or play. I would instead, complete the homework so that when I go home, I don't have any work to do. And I did this all throughout my schooling.
Interesting.
So that was like, I would say, over procrastination. But my question to you is like, and I think you already answered this. So I procrastinate for a lot of things, but when it comes to making presentations for my talks, what I found is that I always make it the night before while I'm in the hotel, at the venue.
Yes.
And I found myself doing it more efficiently and much better over time. And what I find is that for myself, the things which I know will take predictable amount of time. So for instance, in emailing, I know it is a discrete amount of time it would take. That I procrastinate, but things that will take a vague amount of time where there's no limit to improvement, there's no limit to when you end things,
Yes.
or free-flowing things, I leave it to the deadline because I'm more efficient to complete it by the deadline. Because if I start now, I'll end up consuming all the time to the deadline,
That's
my thought
wonderful.
process into that, right? So I think there's also that element of some predictability in terms of time investment that goes
Yes.
into procrastination versus procrastination.
That's really, really, really interesting. I appreciate that suggestion. Let me just a couple of thoughts on
Yeah.
those terrific thoughts. First, I really think that for personnel selection,
Yeah.
businesses and universities should hire people like you,
Yeah.
who do the work they do the homework at school to get it done with. You're an excellent employee. And so that's
But I
wonderful.
think most academics kind of are procrastinators in some ways.
Well, yes. No, I
Yeah.
understand.
Yeah.
We are the weirdest of the weird, we
Yeah.
academics. But I think what you're discussing with respect to temporal uncertainty is very, very key.
Yeah.
And actually, a lot of the work that is going on in our laboratory these days has to do with scheduling, how people decide what to do when. And I will take under advisement your very, very profound, provocative suggestion here that the certainty of the time horizon is a very, very important component in all of this. And I appreciate that. Maybe we can collaborate. You continue to
Yeah, of course.
inform what we're
And
doing.
it kind of also it aligns with the idea that pre and post are not opposite of each other, but actually are orthogonal dimensions.
Yes. That's very helpful as well. I
Yeah.
appreciate that. Because the paper that said that they are not procrastinators and precrastinators are not kind of just opposites, just offered it as, not to criticize that group of personality researchers, but it was just a just so explanation. And you've just, I think, provided a more principled account for why they're not one and the same. That's great. So thank you. Thank you.
So I mean, it's lovely that your work is this is actually having like a real life application. Both. I mean, going back to the end state comfort also, I was thinking that the end state comfort is a very much, and I think people would be using it. I think it's very relevant to how we organize our environment, right? How we organize our physical environment. For instance, especially a high intensity or high stress environment. For instance, and probably bartenders do that, right? Bartenders prepare the bar before
Yes.
people arrive,
Yes.
right?
Uh-huh.
Keeping those things in mind, right? That goes
Yes.
into the planning. And
Yes.
likewise, the surgical room, for instance, and a number of
Yes.
places are organized for end state comfort, right? In subtle or unsettled ways.
Or some sort of preparedness. Yeah.
Yeah.
To be prepared. Yeah, that's right. I mean, all of getting prepared it's some kind of balance between dealing with what's certain and what's uncertain. That's
Right.
what you're driving. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Well, let's see. Actually, I would like we could continue to talk, but I would actually appreciate a 2-minute biology break.
Yeah, sure.
Is that
Let
okay?
let me pause the recording
You
for a few
pause
minutes. Yeah,
and we'll take a 2-minute break.
sure. I'll pause
This
now.
is
So Professor Rosenbaum, there's it's pretty fascinating, and what I find very interesting about your work is that there's like a big gap between motor control, biomechanics, and psychology. So, for instance, when we do experiments in lab, and what we do is we have 5 conditions or like 6 conditions, and we do multiple replicates. And each and every trial is a discrete trial. So you have this task, for instance, in a reach to grasp task, you have a reach to grasp action. And across different conditions, you would have these randomized and you will have 120 trials. What we don't take into account is that in ecological landscape, these actions are interspersed between other activities. For instance, they have contextual effects. They have planning, which does not just go to just one cup, but at multiple scales, the planning goes. For instance, picking it from the table, and maybe then moving to a different room, and then something else, and then something else. So what your work does is brings into the study of actions that whole context into account, and especially the decision making process, right? And I think that's
just a
the
little bit.
yeah.
I think it fails to do that in full, actually. But I think what you're saying is so important. For example, when people um, carry out, do our tasks for us, they often do it with quite different styles. And yeah, maybe I could tell you about another phenomenon
Yeah, of
and
course, of
why it
course.
relates.
Yeah,
So another observation I made led to the discovery of something called the grasp height effect. And in testing participants on the grasp height effect, I'll say what the everyday observation was. Um, it's not discussed in the papers, but there are remarkable stylistic differences in the way people perform the task. It's a quote, pure biomechanics test, quote unquote. But if you watch people do the task, you might be able to wager that this person just had a big fight with their partner,
yeah,
and this other person just found out that they did not get into graduate school, and this other person just learned that they won the Nobel Prize. And these styles or manners of movement have scarcely ever been studied by folks like you and me. And of course, it could be that people do things differently because of trait differences rather than state differences. What was the observation? What's the grasp height effect? It's just another case where if you simply keep your eyes open, you can notice things. So, and forgive me if you're familiar with this. I'll just say it for those who might not, to refresh your memory. And the story goes as follows. One day at home, I think it was when I was on the faculty at Penn State. And this is an unusual thing to discuss, but it's the truth of the story. I don't remember what I had eaten for dinner the night before, but that morning I needed to use a toilet plunger in my toilet. So I used the toilet plunger to empty the toilet. And then, not to get too gross, but anyway, I, rinsed off the the thing, and put it on on the bathroom counter. I put down a paper towel, and I just set it there to dry, and went off to my lab and teaching at the university. And then I came home at the end of the day, having completely forgotten about this stupid toilet plunger. And I said, oh yeah. And so I then embarked on the obvious task. I got to put the thing back down on the floor from whence it came.
yeah.
And so I grabbed it And because of the nature of my interests, I stopped myself in mid-flight. And I noticed that I grabbed this toilet plunger at some point along the shaft. I mean, just because I love doing science, I thought, well, that's interesting. I mean, I could have grabbed this anywhere, and I noticed that I had grabbed it really pretty high up. Well, I started experimenting on myself a little bit, and that we can't do that. But I brought it to the laboratory, and there's some really nice pictures of this in our American Scientist paper called "What's in a Grasp" about all these different things. What we discovered is that if you pick up as ignominious an object as a standing toilet plunger and always in the same initial position, and you just reach out nonchalantly, just grab it and just set it down on a target of variable height in different conditions of the experiment, what we discovered is that the higher the target, the lower the initial grasp. Beautiful. I mean, it's a beautiful, beautiful phenomenon. Everybody who walks in off the street, college student type people anyway, showed this effect. Everybody, without exception. They'll grab high if they're going to put it down low. They grab it low, and it's a very, within the range studied, it's a beautiful linear function. This has been replicated now. We call it the grasp height effect, where you grasp an object is an inverse in our range linear function of the height to which it will be moved. It was shown recently by some German investigators that little kids show this effect, but it's noisier, as one would expect, but they do show the effect. So that was very exciting. I was really thrilled when I noticed that I was doing this without any awareness of it. But to come back to the point you brought up, which is, the fact that our tasks are embedded in our lives, when we were collecting data on this grasp height effect, which we did, we ran experiments in which we invited people to come in and do this task. They had their hand down by their side, just grab the toilet plunger, was at a fixed initial height, put it up there, or in another trial, grab it, put it down there, and so forth. Participants were told we were making videos to show stroke patients to help them with regain their activities of daily living. So they were happy to do that. But finally, to close this loop, some people, I'll ham it up for you a little bit here on this video. Some people went like this. And other people went like this. It was amazing. Amazing. People.
The vigor of the movement, right? Kind of.
How vigorous it was, how jerky it was. We know about nonverbal behavior. This is non-communicative nonverbal behavior. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
This is fascinating because you have a position vector which remains the same no matter how you grasp. Then you have a velocity vector. Then you have a derivative which is acceleration vector, and each of these derivatives might carry different information, right? So, for instance, acceleration or jerk might carry more effective component compared to the planning component, right? So it's very fascinating.
And I think it's very important. It's very unexplored. And I can say this to you as a senior faculty, speaking to a junior faculty, I could easily imagine that you, with your tremendous quantitative sophistication and open-mindedness, might really be able to make a lot of what you just said. Perhaps, NSF funding, NIH funding or something like that. It is a completely, or maybe we can collaborate.
Yeah, no, definitely.
As far as I know, this, you can call it movement stylistics. There's this whole affective world on the one hand, and there's motor control on the other. Of course, people are becoming very interested in friendly robots and things like that. So it's important to characterize these things. But yes, you're right. There are these different layers that are contributing to the output vector. Yeah.
No, this is very much like NSF, PAC, or M3X kind of ideas,
Yeah.
right?
For
I'll
sure.
definitely be in touch, regarding these ideas after this podcast. So, Professor Rosenbaum, two things related to your work. I was wondering, uh, going back to our conversations, from the very beginning. So, first thing is that you mentioned that you were privileged to be at a senior position and ahead of time that you could maintain a research program focused on behavior, which is nice, really nice, because that's where our first insights are coming from, right? From everyday observation, and very fits in very much the idea that we want to understand the world around us rather than someone giving us like a particular problem. A lot of times it's artificial in research and we kind of explore rather than
Yes.
understanding our real human nature and real life. So it's beautiful about that. But what about, you said that you did not need to go into imaging. And I kind of get that. Now there's an increased pressure, and the chances of getting funded are also much higher, like exponentially higher, if you are
Yes.
actually into the brain or into something inside the body,
Yes.
even without any context, in a lot of cases about the behavior. And that's the reason we have recent lot of calls in neuroscience. For instance, a very famous article by John Krakauer that neuroscience needs behavior, how to bring back behavior into neuroscience, which is very ironic that a lot of neuroscience does not have anything to do with behavior. And there
Right.
are other recent calls, both from an alarmist perspective, that we are investing too much in neuroscience and psychology without any context, as well as from a perspective of to change things, that we need to be more aware of the context and the behavior and decision making. So why do you think that has been the case, and how a young investigator would kind of balance out the two, where you do not completely become like a technician over time and actually remain relevant to the behavior of the whole body?
Well, many people who are focused on the brain certainly are not just technicians at all.
Yeah.
I respect very much the advances being made there. And, insofar as there are many very well-established behavioral phenomena, I mean, there's enough to go on already in terms of, well, okay, when people do the Stroop task or some other, very well-established kind of task from cognitive psychology, what is happening in the brain? It's not that we cannot progress with understanding the brain without new behavioral phenomena. So on the other hand, there is definitely a need for people interested in the brain to be very cognizant of, well, it's what the brain is for,
Yes.
which
Right.
is to control behavior. Um, and so I think there are, in terms of funding, I mean, funding is there for people doing very smart behavioral research for sure. They're all, as you know, of course, big teams are very important. But if you come along as a new investigator with a very fresh new take, say that marries biomechanics and emotion and affect in some very new way, it doesn't happen to use brain imaging, I think any reasonably sophisticated, intelligent review panel will say, oh, this is good. This is an important new direction
Yeah.
for us. Um, we would be remiss in our study of the brain if we were indifferent to this. And moreover, the kinds of data and analyses that Professor Mangalam is pursuing clearly has great value for, computer animation, for robotics, for the understanding of kinematics in environments where security concerns arise. This person is walking in a way that,
Oh, you got it. So not myself, but we have a Nebraska Collaborative Initiative, in Nebraska. And one of my colleagues, and I'm part of that project, not for the grant, we are exactly working on this. It's called Gateprint. And what, the team has found is that from the gate, they are able to predict 99.8% of which individual the person is. And
Yes.
they are in touch with some funding agencies regarding how to identify, for instance, misintent based on gait or misintent based on movements. So there
Yes.
are people going into that direction very actively.
So this is building on Gunnar Johansson's famous early moving dot patterns.
So yeah, the biological, yes.
Biological motion, being able to
Yes,
recognize
yes.
individuals, but this is going beyond that, I understand.
Yeah, exactly. Because the motion technologies are getting so good now.
Right.
There are algorithms we can extract a pretty good movement just from the video of a participant rather than putting markers.
But not just gait, but also manual behavior, the way people move around in their kitchens, in their baristas at Starbucks, and all these people.
I always show this video in my talk on manual dexterity. There's this street vendors in India. And so a lot of dishes, you have to put onion on top. So it's basically very fine diced onion with a sprinkle on top. So there's one person, and the volume is so high that one person is constantly cutting onion, right? Like 8 hours on a stretch, the person is just chopping onion, diced onion. And there is a video, I'll forward it to you. The person is blindfolded, and the person is chopping that onion with a speed is unimaginable, probably like 10 pounds of onion within a few minutes, right?
Wow.
And diced, and the eyes are closed. So the person is able to sense the knife, make sure that the knife doesn't touch the skin, knows what is happening to the onion, bring the next onion, and by that time, onion is
love to
chopped,
see that.
right?
Yeah.
So as researchers, we investigate motor dexterity in the lab, but what we know still is so low, so little compared to the extent of dexterity and manual decision making we actually do in our everyday lives, especially people who are involved in these skilled kind of jobs.
Yeah, I mean, that person would be crying for crying.
So that's a reason that person actually puts a tape on the eyes. So,
yeah, of course, sure.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Oh, that's very interesting.
So, Professor Rosenbaum, that one more question I had regarding actually two more. So one is a lot of your theories and observations go kind of question the idea of optimization, because when we talk about optimization, whether it's energetic in biomechanics or in terms of the movement optimization, we do not take into account the context. And what you have shown is that the context leads to behavior which are seemingly not optimized, right? So you agree with that, right? Like that. So is it that optimization ideas are probably not so applicable to the human physiology, which we have derived from mostly cybernetics?
Well, there's always the possibility that there is some criterion function being optimized, being
at some other level. Yeah.
No, it's just that we just don't know what it is, and even for simple reaching motion, there was a very long a saga of people trying to determine what is the thing that is the system is optimizing. It's minimum jerk. No, it's minimum torque change. It's Harrison Wolpert, it's minimum endpoint variability. And so on and so forth. Well, it turns out that context matters. And so there's either some very elusive, high-level factor that is always being chased, and we just are not smart enough to see what it is. Or it may be that things work in a different way. And that's in the work, another line of work of ours, and there's, I guess, the longest paper reproduced in the collected works book is a big 2001 psychological review paper on our so-called posture-based motion planning theory, where, by the way, your findings about whole body sensitivity to for dynamic touch, that really resonates with me. And the idea there with the posture-based theory is that we're always, the system is planning for the position of the entire body. You can't carve it up. You cannot carve nature at its joints in this case. But also in terms of, the high level decision making that goes on, what is that all about? Well, we, in our thinking, were very strongly influenced by the thinking of an economist turned cognitive psychologist named Herbert Simon, who published work in 1957 as an economist, for which he won the Economics Nobel Prize. And that concept is satisficing. And what Simon found interviewing business managers is, contrary to what Simon had been taught as an economist, what classical economic theory says, they were not trying to optimize some variable. They were not trying to minimize cost and maximize profit. However obvious that would seem. No, what they were doing in practice was satisficing, meaning that they tried to be in some bowl of attraction rather than a point of attraction. Anywhere within this basin was fine, as long as the cost wasn't too great, and as long as the profit was above some value anywhere, that's fine. If you're in that space, then that's good. And that's what they did in practice. And Simon made the argument that this is, in fact, an extremely rational way to go, notwithstanding the traditional view of classical optimization in economics and also psychology. And the reason it's rational is because it's computationally incredibly difficult to locate an exact optimal point. And that's well known, but it became well known through Herb Simon's work. Simon then shifted gears and went on to study human problem solving. Simon and Newell and Simon, human problem solving.
Which we cite, very often in our
it's classic work. It came out of this idea, but we in our thinking, we think that the selection, or however you want to say, the formation of actions is based on satisficing, and moreover, it is what we do in deciding how to act unconsciously, we don't think about it, is that there are different weights for different aspects. And that's in fact what a task is. A task for us is, well, if you can think of it as a weight vector. You can think about it as the relative importance of all the possible factors that matter to you. And so if you put a lot of weight on, not bending over a lot to reach for an object. That's really important. And by contrast, walking far, that's okay. Well, then you will choose, a walk around the table with a small reach. And if you just heard that, your wife is leaving you, that's really important, and kind of acting in a way that, deals with that emotional, challenge. Well, that's much more important than moving perfectly nicely the way some biomechanics experimenter asks you to do, because you're in a crappy mood at that moment.
Yeah.
And it's more important. So the idea is, and in the posture-based motion planning theory, the formal computational modeling we did and the animations we generated for whole body movements, planar movement, it gets much more complicated in 3D, and it's just kinematic, so it's very limited.
Yeah.
Is all the actions are chosen with respect to a very malleable, a very plastic, modifiable set of task constraints. So, for example, just to get very specific, like, for example, how is it that you can reach for a point by reaching forward with your elbow and shoulder and hip? You're bending forward while sitting, and your hip hurts like hell. You just really bumped your hip. Well, we have all sorts of simulations where very naturally what'll happen is that a goal posture will be selected that entails very small rotation of the hip if the cost of hip rotation goes through the roof because you just hurt your hip. Similarly for your shoulder or your elbow. And it just falls out. But the idea is that, something like the pain you have in your elbow, I mean, that's a hard thing to represent with, Newtonian mechanics. And yet it's obviously very, very relevant to how we move physically.
Very elegant point. Yes.
So these constraints come into play in the choices we make. And I think it can be thought of in very practical, sensible terms, in fact. So that's how we thought about it. But the affective part that you and I talked about earlier needs a lot more attention, a lot more work. Yeah.
And that also brings, it's a perfect segue. The next question and the last one I wanted to ask you was about, the individuals with disorders, neurodegenerative disorders like Parkinson's and other movement issues, stroke, for instance, right? And your work is very relevant to those conditions as well. But have you seen development with your theories in those disease populations?
I know that the end-state comfort work has been pursued with dyspraxic patients and others. I have also, maybe I can use your question to share another phenomenon, because in the end, what people care about are the discoveries. And in fact, I recently gave a talk back at Penn State, I used to be there, to Mark Latash and others in the Action Club. And I shared with them a result that maybe I can share with you right now, which is, well, it was another observation.
Yeah.
Starting from the real world, which is, so I love my wife, and even though we've been married for many, many years, we often take walks together and we hold hands.
I love it how you said even when we are married together, we still take walks.
We hold hands. And at one point, I kind of noticed that as we walk together hand in hand, and as other people walk together hand in hand, they're not squeezing each other's hands for dear life. What happens is that there's gentle touch that is maintained. And then I started thinking about what I called it haptic tracking. So, and we do this all the time. So, in fact, so a little kid on one of those push things where the dad or the mom pushes them, their feet are on the pedals. And what their feet are in gentle contact with the pedals and maintaining contact. Birds, I think, sitting on telephone wires are not holding on for dear life. There's some kind of, I'm sure of it. I don't know of any
Yeah, they are
data
ready
on
to
this.
they're ready to fly always.
They're ready to fly,
Yeah.
and there must be instant compensatory. So I took this into the laboratory. This was published in JPHPP in the mid 2005 or so, with Amanda Dawson and John Chalice. This was again at Penn State, in which we simply studied haptic tracking, and we had people hold their hand up to a vertical surface and try to maintain very gentle touch with a moving object. And they could do that trivially, very, very easy. And there was some a clever mechanical system was designed such that they could not press hard enough to be passively dragged. If they did, actually, we used a pair of rare earth magnets on either side of a pane of glass. So if you pressed hard enough on the magnet on your side,
let's take,
it'll, but the other magnet driving it would fall down. But anyway, what we did there, and it bears on therapy, which I'm going to come to wrap this up, was because it was so easy, we asked, could we actually show that human beings, without any training at all, could haptically track two objects moving at the same time, even with all kinds of weird phase relations and things like that. So like so circular objects being haptically tracked with the two hands, blindfolded. And actually the two objects are moving at different frequencies. So there's a continuously varying phase.
Yeah.
Total nightmare. You could never do this if you were just actively trying to, take pieces of chalk. We can't draw squares and circles at the same time. One of the experiments in that paper was a square and a circle, and people can do it perfectly when they're being, I shouldn't say driven, they're just, the task in their head is just maintain contact. And each hand is just staying in contact through very, very light touch. But the system is, I think what it's doing is each hand is responding locally in time, even with a monosynaptic connection between somatosensory cortex and motor cortex. We know of such loops like that. So if you feel a shear force, you can correct instantly and just stay in gentle touch. The two hands, without the involvement of higher level voluntary centers that are directing traffic for now, make a circle. Yeah. Our participants could do, continuously, these two circles. They could talk, they could hold conversations while this is going on. It's an amazing, I think it's one of my neatest findings. I'm very excited about it. It's one of these things where it hasn't really been picked up as much as I would like. But I think one reason why it's of special interest, apart from the demonstration that people can in a way, voluntarily escape the kinds of, phase and frequency coupling constraints that are well known from Scott Kelso and others. They can totally circumvent that through sheer touch, but it also has implications, I think, for stroke recovery, because in stroke recovery, a big challenge is getting people to maintain the mobility of their limbs. And what doesn't work so well is moving them around passively. That it doesn't really do much therapeutically. And when you say to them, do this voluntarily, in so many words, people have a hard time doing it. They don't want to complain, or they have problems with high level control. So by having patients haptically track, they can be moving their muscles voluntarily, and hopefully that could be of some benefit to them
No, very,
therapeutically.
very, 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 very interesting point. If you have local feedback loops, you really want to free up, the higher order resources.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
no,
nice.
very interesting point.
That's that same point that you and I have been coming to, which is it's nice to free up the mind.
Free up the mind, yes. It definitely is. No, that's wonderful, Professor Zamom. It was a really fascinating journey with your work, and very special that so much of it is coming out of your daily observations. I'm pretty sure you're a great observer of human
Well,
behavior.
all of us,
Yeah,
all of us can be. We just need to keep our eyes and ears open and our
yeah,
touches and so forth.
right.
I
Thank you,
thank
Professor
you.
Zamom, for coming to the show, and for the viewers, I really suggest you look at a book, Cognitive Control of Action, Selected Works of David Rosenbaum. It's not yet in print, but I will post a link in the description as soon as the book comes out. Highly recommended reading.
And I thank you so very much, Madhur, for doing this. And I look forward to being in touch with you and anybody who survived this whole presentation. Please feel free to be in touch with me, and I'll be very, very happy to communicate with you. So
A
thank you
pleasure.
for this really great honor. I appreciate it, and lots of luck to you.
Thanks so much, Professor Zamom. Have a great day ahead.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, bye-bye.